Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to wait a little bit while we wait for people to join. I've gotten my cup of tea, and we're just going to let people take a little time coming in. Okay, welcome to Unscripted, Conversations about the Future of Research. This is the third episode of this week-long series. Yesterday, I was the guest in the conversation with Dr. Erica Walker, and I have to say it was such a pleasure to have a conversation that just goes where it takes you. And that's really what we mean by going unscripted. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, let me introduce myself. I'm Mary Bassett. I'm a physician, a mother, a grandmother, and I'm speaking to you today from the Francois Xavier Bagnoud Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. This is a center that I direct here. I've worked in public health for about 40 years now, and a big chunk of my working life has been spent in leadership roles at state and local level. I was in New York City and the New York State Health Commissioner, and my working life, actually, I would say my life, has been guided by the idea that health is a human right. So today, I'm really excited to be in conversation with our guest, Brian Nosek, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia and the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Open Science, which is going to be the hat that he's wearing with us today. It's really great to be in conversation with you, Brian, and thanks everybody for being with us today. Before we get started with our unscripted, it truly is unscripted conversation, I have a couple of logistics to go through with you. First, we're streaming live on both LinkedIn Live and YouTube. And wherever you're joining us from, we're really glad you're here. This episode's being recorded. It will become publicly available later today, and it will be emailed to all of you. I also need to note that you won't see them on the screen today, but credit is due to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the team that's helped us with Unscripted. And thanks for giving us a platform to do something a little unusual in the Unscripted series, an opportunity to think out loud as researchers about how to improve the way that our society produces, collects, shares, and uses knowledge around health. So the conversation earlier this week has been, and the one that I had with Erica yesterday really elevated the issue of the incentive structure in academic research and the ways that's made it difficult to honor and involve community voices, set priorities according to community needs, and also, we reflected on the way biases find their way into academic research. So a lot of that was really thought-provoking and inspiring, and I'm going to be turning to Brian in his role in promoting better access to science to enhance understanding of scientific knowledge production. Yesterday, Erica, who interviewed me, or rather I was her guest yesterday, left us with an image of her standing in a I think it was Fitzgerald Park, a park overlooking the city of Boston, and standing there and thinking how noisy it was. And that became a guiding motivation for the research that followed. So she got her inspiration for research, listening to all that noise on a beautiful day in a beautiful park, not in a lecture hall. So that is something that I keep thinking about. So as we talk, I'm hoping that you'll hear things that you think make sense to you. We're going to continue this conversation on incentive structures. I'm looking forward to diving in. I need to remind people of the importance of the chat, which lets you talk to each other. Not only ask us questions. In fact, I'm not sure how well the chat will work as a way of directing questions that we can pick up and incorporate, because I'm likely to get really involved in my conversation with Brian. But this function allows you to have discussion and debate among yourself, and I really hope you will dive into it. I'd like to remind you the importance of following the community guidelines that guide the Robert Wood Johnson and all nonprofit foundations, that you have to refrain from discussing election campaigns, candidates, political parties. You can't put that in the chat. You can be frank, but we can't have direct electioneering. And to get you all interested in the chat, I'm going to ask you a really easy question. Yesterday, Erica asked people what their favorite frozen food was. Mine is peas. But today, I'm just going to ask you something that I'm sure all of you can really readily answer. And that is, if you could pop in the chat where you're joining us from today. And I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as we go along. And I was about to also mention the idea of these T-shirts, which is a fun idea that's come up and it's part of the Unscripted preparations. And that is, when you hear something that sounds like a good soundbite, for lack of a better word, could you just tag it and say, put it on a shirt or hashtag shirt? And there are going to be T-shirts actually made. Some have already been made. There's going to be one made. I'm hoping that I'm not violating some secret by saying that the tag from our conversation yesterday is what creates health. And these T-shirts, you can get up to 200 will be made available free, but you have to register in order to get the information on how to get the T-shirt. So keep in mind things that you would like to see on a T-shirt, and RWJ is going to design a really cool T-shirt. We're hoping that you're going to have some fun with us today, that the Put It on a Shirt will carry the message from these conversations into other fora, to your coffee shop, to meetings you go to, and shift the narrative of how we do science. So, all right, I'm pretty sure that I covered everything that we needed to cover at the top of this conversation. And Brian, let's get started. I'm going to call you Brian, and I'm assuming it's okay if you call me Mary. We'll go on a first name basis. The center that you co-founded and of which you're the executive director celebrated 10 years. So I expect when you got started, a lot of people told you that this was maybe not the greatest idea. So you did it anyway. And your mission, as I understand it, as I pulled from somewhere on the internet, is we envision a future scholarly community in which the process, content, and outcomes of research are openly accessible by default. So you don't have to negotiate, plead, or pay. These data, the processes by which they were obtained, the analytic approach that led to results, all of those should be accessible publicly by default. Can you just talk a little bit about, well, first, what you're doing, and also what led you to take a chance on doing something that probably others suggested wasn't the greatest career decision?
Yes, happy to. And thank you for leading this conversation, and to RWJF for facilitating all of this. I'm delighted to be part of it. The core interest for the center is to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. And we arrived at this as a concern based on experience as a researcher in the community, and then observation of challenges of science as a social system for what is rewarded for researchers' career advancement versus how we idealize and want science to operate as a system. So most people get into science for the ideals that we ascribe to it, that we learned in 5th grade when we were learning how science works, right? It's sort of this open conversation of generating ideas and coming up with ways to try to generate some evidence about those ideas, and then sharing that evidence with others and arguing about it and saying, well, what about, until we sort of sort through possibilities and arrive at conclusions that stand up to that interrogation and the poking at it and figuring out what might be and how it might be. But that ideal, while most, all researchers come into the work with that, can give way to, how is it that I can get a job and I can keep my job in science? And those rewards, key rewards to be a participant in the way the system is structured now, are based on, can you produce papers that are published? And can you generate resources, grants that fund your work and the work of your institution? And paper, as the currency of advancement, creates some reward challenges in the system that lead us away from the ideals and instead create challenges internal to science as a system, how it is researchers communicate and work through their work amongst each other, and external to the system for how it is the work gets translated and engages the public in, as you framed earlier, figuring out what questions to ask and how people can be involved in the process of discovery and the translation of what is discovered into practice. And we can unpack more of that, but just to briefly get to the second part of your question, is this was a problem, an interesting start to the organization, in that almost no one in the research community said, oh no, those aren't issues. Like, everybody's like, oh my God, let me tell you about all these challenges of how the reward system is totally frustrating and how I have to do all these things that aren't really advancing the science, but really are just advancing my career. I have to do them. So everyone agrees these are real challenges, and I wish it was different. And simultaneously, everyone agrees, oh, there's no way we can change the system. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't under our control. Those people,
as an individual researcher,
like, what could I possibly do? And then even if collective researchers, well, it's the funders. And of course, then the funders say, no, it's the publishers. And the publishers say, no, it's the institutions. So even the communities where you'd say, oh, they have the levers, everyone has this sense, and everyone in quotes has a sense that actually changing the system is beyond what they can do. But of course, as you know, that's how systems fail to change, is that no one feels empowered to actually start to pursue change.
Yeah.
And so, why go into that? Well, because I think, like most sort of entrepreneurial pursuits, failing is fine. Of course, I don't want to fail, but if fail, then we'll do something else. We'll try a different way, whatever. But we got to try something. So let's start and see what happens.
I can't help but listening to you. I did more conventional research early in my working life when I was in Zimbabwe, working mostly on HIV, and we had large cohort studies. And I'm embarrassed to say that we talked about what we called MPUs, minimum publishable units.
Yeah.
And the idea was to, don't get it all out in one paper, break it all up.
Slice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And these, like, who would think about those things outside of the context of how the reward works, right? You describe the system to, somebody that doesn't spend every day in science, and they say, what? It doesn't even make sense. Why would you even think that way?
Right.
But that's where we are.
I couldn't help but think of the fact that, if anything, over especially the last couple of years, public skepticism about science has grown.
Yeah.
So whatever we're doing, it hasn't sort of stopped the fact that increasingly people, including people in very high levels of political leadership, dismiss science as a guidepost for
Yeah.
how to, set our policies and practices. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? I mean, how do you think that making the facts, which is what I think of data,
Yeah.
um, more readily available, letting people have access to them, the ability to reproduce or even replicate, um, to replicate the analyses. Um, when people don't are just not that interested in facts.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a big challenge. And of course, the general evidence is decline of trust in institutions
Everything.
across the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
And science is not immune to that. And the
Yeah.
declines are pronounced. And it's not just COVID declines, it's general declining trust in science. And that is a big challenge of its own. But science also has a unique opportunity. And the opportunity is to confront what has become an open system of making knowledge claims. Pre-internet, to oversimplify history, science had a real advantage, right? The ivory tower was something that one got to use as a reputational stance. Like, we have studied this, and here we deliver to you the findings and knowledge that we have gained. And that prior system helped sustain science, perhaps not even appropriately sustained it, but sustained it as an authority in the communication of information. But post-internet, to continue to oversimplify, anybody can make a knowledge claim. And there are many more, as Skip Lupia, who is at University of Michigan, said, there are others that are not scientists who write faster, write better, and make more interesting claims than scientists do. And if it's a competition simply on claims in an open system where people suddenly have access to lots of information from many sources, then science, as it tries to practice based on claims and authority, is going to lose. So the real opportunity that science has is that, unlike many of the other sources of information, science can show its work. It can show, how is it that we arrive at this conclusion? Why is it that we favor this versus that? The transparency, not just of the result, here's the outcome, but of how we got there, is a critical feature of what makes science worth trusting as an enterprise. And also, I think, and this is a way that maybe engages the community a bit more, is by showing the process, not just of discovery of the original data, but the process of interrogation of that, the debate, the discussion in the community, provides that information that science is trustworthy because it doesn't trust itself. That we're constantly skeptical of our own claims, and that's part of how science gains trustworthy knowledge, is because people are saying, but really, but what about, but what about, but what about? And that's a great feature. And if we could have a more robust public engagement with that as a feature, that might help with maintaining or enhancing public trust in science.
I think I heard it, a shirt type thing is science is trustworthy because it doesn't trust itself.
Yeah.
Or because, maybe we should say, because it always tests itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that too.
I looked
that's
briefly
right.
at the chat. We have people joining us from all over, including there's somebody from Mexico City. Thank you for joining. So I don't know quite who people are or why they're here. But it may be that not everybody understands the ideas of replicability and reproducibility. And I think that those concepts, as part of the coherence and part of the trustworthiness of science, might be worth you just taking a minute to go over with all of us.
Yeah. When we pursue scientific evidence, we're not usually just making a claim about that one occasion. Here's this one thing that happened this one time. mostly scientific claims are about generalizable knowledge. We're trying to say, we gathered this evidence in this occasion. We think it means something more general about how viruses work or about how this drug will impact people's health in some way beyond the data that we collected. So key parts of making generalizable knowledge claims is to be able to show that when I observe this thing, I did this, I observed this outcome, that's repeatable in some way. Both you could take the data that I generated and reanalyze it and say, oh yeah, I get it too. He didn't make a mistake in analyzing the data. That's a simple reproduction. That should almost always be true. If we analyze the same data the same way, get the same result. That's a verification. Replication is saying, well, I found it in my study here in Charlottesville, Virginia. What if you did it in Massachusetts? Do you find the same thing? And if you don't, wait a second. Why is it that my sample might have shown this phenomenon and your sample didn't? We didn't replicate the phenomenon, maybe meaning that I didn't quite characterize it the right way, or I didn't realize that, oh, my sample is almost all people who are upper middle class and have these features of their lives, and you had a more diverse sample, and it turns out this particular phenomenon doesn't occur there for whatever reason. So those are key parts of establishing generalizable knowledge. And the connection to this openness and transparency issue, how do we be more open with our research, is that transparency helps you to see how I did my research so that you could try to repeat it yourself, right? I want to be able to see the methodology, not just my report, the paper at the end where I'm advertising all the things that I did in my work, but you can actually see the work. And then sharing is you can actually get access to that data. And maybe you'd say, you know what, you didn't really look at these subgroup analyses that I think are really important because these particular populations tend to be underrepresented in this area of work. And if you don't pay attention to them specifically, you might miss something important about the phenomenon. So the openness really helps to drive, we presume, improvements of not just rigor overall, but reproducibility more widely.
Right. No, that's really clear. And what do people need to make public to make that possible? So it's both the raw data and the code, I would assume.
The code that they use to analyze the data. Most data analysis occurs via computer now, and some of it very complex. So you need access to the analytic code. And then the protocol or the procedure that one went through.
What you said you were going to do.
Yeah, this is how I designed the study. Yeah. This is how we engage people. These are the questions we asked if it was survey. All of that stuff is the research. But the paper rarely provides all of the detail. It says, oh, we did some stuff. Here's kind of a summary. This is what we found. Yeah. And that's just not enough.
Yeah. I was talking yesterday about my experience at the University of Zimbabwe, a small country in Southern Africa, where, we really struggled to conduct research. And we often encountered researchers from wealthy, well-resourced universities who pointed out to us that they could analyze our data more rapidly and possibly better than we could, and why not just turn it over? Yeah. Now, that's a kind of developing country, wealthy country dynamic, but I imagine it exists even within a wealthy country like this one. Not all universities are as well-resourced as the one that I'm sitting in. Yeah. But still, the researchers, for all the reasons you've mentioned, need to get credit for their work, and also just as a matter of justice, should get credit for their work. I remember being in a conference where somebody was blithely describing how he would go door to door purchasing data from the, from researchers. Yeah. By the time I left the University of Zimbabwe, I think I was earning $200 a week. So you can imagine that there's economic reasons that a researcher might allow their data. Anyway, you get the idea. how do we make sure that data sharing somehow addresses the kind of power relationships that can exist between and among data producers, research producers?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there is real risk that it only reinforces and exacerbates those disparities in resources for exactly the reasons that you describe, right? A very well-resourced lab can consume enormous amounts of data and execute research on it very rapidly, way faster than communities or labs or individuals that have fewer resources. So that risk is real. The flip side is that there is also opportunity to use openness as a catalyst to really shift those disparities in a different direction. But to get there, it requires addressing multiple features that are hard to address and are really the system problems that you spend so much time talking about more in the broader context. One of those is that the current reward system for individual researchers is about the paper, but it is also sort of the philosopher model of science, a vertically integrated model, where for you to be a contributor to science, you need to design the study, you need to generate the data, you need to analyze the data, you need to write up the report, you need to publish the report. You do all the stuff. That vertically integrated model works really well if you have resources. And the more resources you have, the better. So in any system that we have where there is unequal allocation of resources, the vertical integration model will just, the people with more will get more. They'll generate more papers because they can do all the parts. The flip concept that openness creates as an opportunity is inclusion. And that is a horizontal model of contribution. That instead of you needing to do all the things and you get the one credit of the paper, that each of us researchers should get credit for the contributions that we make. If I am good at generating data, I have access to interesting sources to generate data, but that's really where my resources are, is to generate the data and not to do the other steps, then I should get credit as a scholarly contribution, the generation of the data. That's my citable unit. That's my system, the thing that I can get rewarded for. If I'm at an institution where I have a heavy teaching load and I don't have time to run a lab that generates research on it itself, but I'm really good at evaluating research. I'm an excellent peer reviewer. I'm excellent providing critique and suggestions for how to do things differently, improve them. Why shouldn't that be credited as a scholarly contribution in the same way as if I was a research producer myself? So a horizontal model aims to find ways to be much more inclusive. There's different ways for people to get involved in the research process and then collectively produce the ultimate finding output, but with many different people getting credit for the ways in which they themselves made contributions to that work.
I mean, that makes sense to me, except for the fact that we put the highest value on people who generate hypotheses.
Yeah.
And we consider that the core intellectual work of research. I had colleagues from Ghana who wrote a piece published in the Lancet declaring we are not the drawers of protocols or the bearers of data. In other words, you know,
right. We're not the service
exactly.
Class. Right. Yes, exactly.
And I mean, to be honest, many of these individuals got their training at, in schools in the UK and the US, but suddenly when they go back to Ghana, their role is confined. So this kind of brings me to something that, there's something in the chat that let me see if I can bring it up. And it's it's this, and I'm summarizing, and I hope that whoever wrote it will accept it, that we sort of seem to blithely think that if we come up with the science and the data and the truth, that policymakers will listen to us.
Of course. It's right here.
I guess they want to acknowledge that that's not always the case.
No, it's not. That's right. Yes.
Um,
Sorry.
Go
Continue.
ahead. No, over to you.
Yeah. No, I just affirming that the truth doesn't always win. There are many other factors engaged in that. And simultaneously, that's the business of science, is the pursuit of the truth. And so there are social, political, economic factors that also are part of the practical reality of how do we get science engaged, involved, taken seriously, incredibly in the community. And I think it's in sciences as a community's interest to understand and recognize those factors, so they're not naive to exactly the point of what I hear is the point of that comment, which is we just need to do good work and it'll be fine. But rather, we need to do good work, show our work, and recognize how it is that in the social system of reality can get translated to have its impact. And have people that, like again, diversifying the roles of contributorship to science. Someone who is really effective at translating research that someone else produced to a policymaker or a practitioner or everyday public citizen that wants or needs to know that information. That should be a rewarded role, just as much of advancing science as the person who generated the hypothesis.
I agree with that. But obviously, like many things, it's complicated.
It is.
And it brings me to something, most of my work has focused on structural racism.
Yeah.
And the main idea here is that the way the racial hierarchy in the United States in particular is maintained, and this would also apply to thinking about gender, I expect, but is not just because individuals have a set of beliefs or biases, which is, I know we talked about that you worked on implicit bias with Mahzarin Banerjee, but that we have structured into our society ways in which these inequalities are produced and reproduced, regardless of how each of us feels as an individual, which is important, but that's what I've worked on. And I just wonder how you reflect on how your commitment to open science, which I support, and I think we need to figure out ways to improve the incentives, protect researchers who work with communities, protect communities who contribute data, but also should have input into the analysis, and protect. Anyway, we need to figure out how to adjust the incentives. But I wonder how you think the whole equity conversation makes it into a conversation about improving access to data as a way of helping people believe in science?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of the discussion about open science and reproducibility is inward focused, meaning toward the research community itself and how our better sharing can facilitate the dynamic exchange of information, accelerate discovery, et cetera. But your question, especially in the equity framing, is really that outward focused importance of openness and transparency, which is how do we invite pathways in for people that have interests, whose communities are affected by the research that's being done, have points of access in that aren't just at the end. And that's important too, right? They should be able to access the results that taxpayer money paid for or otherwise, because those results have implications. So we need to work there. But the entire life cycle of research offers opportunities for input and engagement that really involve in co-creation processes with communities that have an interest in what the questions are that are asked. I think that came up in your conversation yesterday with Erica.
With Erica, yeah.
How is it that we can actually activate opportunities for communities to shape the questions, to inform those questions, right? A lot of, it's so many times they sort of like, we found this thing. And they're like, great, that's totally irrelevant for what we're doing. Like, we don't have those circumstances here. Like, I mean, great that you found that. So at every stage of the process, facilitating dialogue is part of the open transparency mission writ large. And besides just making the science better and more informed and more connected, I think it ends up having that impact on public trust. Because when I am part of a process, when I can see it happening, when I can see how it responds and is responsive to my input, then I'm much more likely to trust it, much likely to believe in that, because I'm part of it. It's not just that thing that happens over there by people that I don't know, with resources I can't access. It's part of what we're doing.
Right. Right. No, that really makes sense to me. One of the examples that's often given of really rapid sharing of information was all the data that went into the Human Genome Project.
Yes.
Do you just want to say something about that? And I mean, everybody seems to agree that was whatever I think about the notion that, that this unknown individual's genome was sequenced as a way of the holy grail of understanding human health. Obviously, I don't think it is, but still, it was an incredibly collaborative project.
Incredible.
And if you could just, you might have thought that might have been an exemplar just for people listening. They just, as soon as they got it, the sequencing, they posted it.
Yeah.
They made it publicly available.
Yes.
You may well know more about it than I do, Brian, but.
No, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
It was sort of a condition of participation in the project was that everything would be openly shared. No one would have a advantage of closed access to the data for their own career advancement. And partly, I think that was, it was sort of a mini structural solution in the context of an occasion where everyone recognized, oh, this is really important. The opportunity is too big to be involved. So I am okay with giving up my normal proprietary feelings about my data belonging to me, and I want to publish as much as I can, whatever, and contribute to this shared mission. And it is a fabulous example. And what's interesting is that it's an example that comes up regularly across the sciences when there is
public health, actually.
Yes, right. When there is either recognition that the aggregate data is so much more valuable than the individual data, right? When we can merge all of this data together, we can make much stronger inferences. Or when the instrumentation is so precious that we realize that the real value is access to the instrumentation rather than the data that's produced. So Hubble, the telescope, it's routine for data to be public and open because it's a shared resource, right? Nobody owns these telescopes. The James Webb Telescope, no individual scientist or lab gets to use it all the time. Everybody applies, and all of the data is openly accessible. So that's a repeatable thing, and I think it's worth looking more at opportunities to extend that model because it works. It has worked.
I wonder if there's anything that I haven't raised that you would like to talk about. One thing that you said it at the top of our conversation, and I think it's worth reiterating. You said that you are not afraid to fail. And that's an unusual remark to come from an academic or actually from anybody in a leadership position. But of course, it's true that if we aren't being ambitious enough, if we don't accept that sometimes we'll fail.
Right.
And I just wonder if you could just say a few words on that. We're coming up on the end of our time, but it really did strike me.
Yeah. And I'd be interested reflexively in yours, your response to that as well, how you think about it in your own work is, the problem.
I fail all the time.
Yeah, right. I'm so used to it.
The further along I get, the more willing I am to fail, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, science is about failure. Like once one has been in doing it for a while, you realize, oh my God, I know nothing. I've studied this. There's these really funny, cartoons that show how much you think you know about something, and this sort of this rapid rise when you start to study an area of research, and then when you become a real expert, you think you know less than when you started. And that's probably true. It's because we're constantly confronted with the things that we don't know. And our hypotheses are constantly like, oh, yeah, that's not quite right. How would we do that? So that, at least for me, I've sort of embraced as, okay, I don't know. But then the other part of it, in terms of like starting an organization or taking on a big problem, is that the only way to make progress is to start. And if it has to work as a requirement for big problems, then we'll never start, because they're big problems. We don't know how to solve them. And so, similarly, your work on reparations and trying to address structural racism, like, oh yeah, what's the solution? Lay it out for me today. And it's ridiculous claim, right? It's like, well, we got to try some things. How about here? How about here? How about here? We'll build, and then we'll back up, and then we'll build.
Right. No, that really sounds right to me. I really wish that we had more time. I did realize one thing that I didn't ask you about is open access to journal articles. That's the main way that I've, in my day-to-day work, confront, because I pay these huge charges to make sure that all of our fellows, when they publish, I mean, the last charge was $4,000 for open access because it included color images. But can you just say something? I'm just going to stay with this as long as I can scrounge up the funds. I think it's the right thing to do because increasingly many university libraries can afford subscriptions. If you could just say something about open access.
Yeah, well, for those less familiar with this, the system of academic publishing is one where the research is produced by researchers at universities. It's given over to publishers with the copyright. The publisher now owns it. And then the publishers sell it back to the universities for more. It's a fabulous business model and very, very, very profitable. And it interferes in several ways with the production of research and the dissemination of that research to everyone. So open access is the basic concept of it should be free to read.
Right.
Everybody should be able to have access to it. This sort of like everybody's like, well, yeah, these are public goods, right? If we're publishing the research, this is public goods. It should be open. But the business model, but the existing one has defenders because it is very profitable. And it's hard to change to a new model that is more equitable. So you're able to pay open access fees, right? If the standard flip model is that the author pays a fee to make it open access so that the publisher doesn't make money by subscriptions to gain access. Instead, they make their money by the people publishing paying for the publication. But that then challenges equity for those labs that have the resources to do it.
That's right.
So that model probably doesn't work in the long run either. And the community that's working on open access is really wrestling now with alternative models that are allow it to be free for the authors and free for the readers. And it's paid for through more maybe collective work by the institutions that support science getting done.
Right. Maybe it should be built into research awards. I mean, I don't know. But there ought to be a way that we could leverage the fact that most of the U.S. research enterprise is supported by the federal government.
Yeah.
We're out of time. And I have to not neglect some of my final charges, which is it's like last call to put something in the chat that you think should be on a shirt. And you can be on the lookout for an email later today with a recap of today's conversation and the details for tomorrow. and you have to register to get a T-shirt. They're free for the first 200, and I think that may be all that there are. So be sure to register so that you can get a T-shirt while supplies last and take our conversation further. We are carrying on for the whole week. Brian, you're going to be the host tomorrow of somebody who maybe you want to say a few words about. And I very much hope that everybody continues to tune in and watch these unscripted conversations. Brian, do you want to just tell us a little bit about who you'll be speaking with tomorrow?
Yes, I am excited to have a chance to meet and chat with Keolu Fox. Keolu is part of the Indigenous Futures Institute at the University of Chicago or University of California, San Diego. And I'm hoping that we'll start to unpack one of the things that came up in our conversation, which is the control and access to data for communities that are impacted by the use of that data. And this obviously has had historical challenges in Indigenous communities. And that's where Keolu has very deep expertise in thinking about what is it that responsible data sharing that can involve communities and being able to be empowered to make decisions for how and when their data are shared and used can be done effectively. So that will be great fun to unpack, along with anything else that he is inspired to share. If there are viewers that have questions that they want me to put to Keolu when we talk tomorrow, do feel free to email us. It's unscripted@rwjf.org is that email address. And Mary, I'm just very grateful for the conversation. It was great fun.
It was really fun.
I really appreciate
I should have told people that we actually have never interacted before.
No.
And this was really good.
It was great. It was great. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And I hope that we will see you tomorrow.